Welcome to the farm.
Welcome to the farm. I'm Justin, and over the past 2.5 years or so, I've gotten into doing some fabrication stuff. I built this rock bucket that's right behind me, and recently I've been working on turning it into a grapple as well. And I've done all of that welding with flux core wire, so I didn't have any shielding gas with my MIG welder. Today, we're going to change that. We're going to hook it up to some shielding gas. All right, so here's my welder. It's a little bit dirty because it's, in a barn with a dusty dirt floor, so there's always dust in the air. I do keep it covered with an actual cover that's made by Hobart to cover this thing when it's not in use. But still, dirty barn, it gets dirty. But anyway, it's a Hobart Handler 210 MVP. It runs on 115 or 230 volt, and I currently have it set up on 230 volt just because I think the higher voltage gives me a nicer weld and nicer weldability. Before we go ahead and swap this thing over, I'm going to grab a couple pieces of steel. We're going to do a weld with the flux core, and then when we're all done, we'll do a weld with the gas. We'll compare the two welds and see what they look like. So I got 4 pieces of steel here. They are cut from 2 different bars, but I have one piece on each set from one bar and the other piece from each set from the other bar. So I got these edges all cleaned up. We are ready to weld. We're going to start with our flux core. So here's my flux core weld. It's actually one of the best looking flux core welds I have ever done. So I'm pretty impressed with myself on that one. You guys may think it doesn't look good, but I'm not a professional welder. I do this for fun, learning how to do it, that kind of stuff. Let's go ahead, get the machine swapped over, and then we can get a gas weld done. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the old flux core wire out, just because I don't need any wire in to set up the gas. So I'm just going to trim off the end, lay that off to the side, loosen my clamp, and then I'm just going to wind it up. So the next thing I need to do is switch the polarity of my leads. I have it set up right now for flux core because that's what I was running. Going to a solid wire, these just have to get flipped. So with that swapped out, let's put the tank on this thing. All right, so here's my tank. I ended up going with the 75% argon, 25% carbon dioxide. The directions or the owner's manual said with the gauge that's provided that you should do a straight argon. But looking at the gauge, it does say AR/CO2. And when I did research online to try to find a gauge that would be a mixed gas, it was the exact same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and run the one that came with the welder because I think it's going to work just fine. Now I opted to go with the big tank, the 125 cubic feet, just because for me, running into town to get gas when I run out is kind of a pain. It's at least a half hour one way. So I'd rather have a lot of volume and not have to exchange it as quickly. The downside to that is this was really expensive because you have to buy the tank first. So for me to buy the tank, I think it was $487 to buy the tank, and then it was another $83 for the gas. Plus I had to buy the solid wire, which is another 60 bucks. So all in to swap this out, I am at over $660, I think it was. It's quite an investment. Whereas with the flux core, you buy $110, $120 spool, you're good to go. The upside to this now is next time I go to get gas, it's only going to cost me 83 bucks to get gas. And the spool is only like 55, 60 bucks. So in the long run, I'll end up coming out ahead with this. It's just a big investment up front. So let's go ahead and get the gauges and stuff installed on here and get on the machine. So the directions said to crack the valve to bleed out any debris or anything that might be in there. Okay. So as I'm doing this, I just want to make sure that my gauges are staying vertical. Tighten that down. And I'm just going to spin this so it kind of faces the front of the machine so it's easier to see. Alright. Now I'm just going to take the hose that came with the machine and I'm going to remove this little cap here. Slide that on. And then move my hose clamp up. Okay. Now I can just pull this cap out of the back of the machine. And thread in our hose. So now that we got the machine all hooked up, I got my gas nozzle on my gun. We need to set the flow rate. When I was reading the directions, it said you should set it up to about 20 CFH. I think that's what I'm going to run with. It did say check the manufacturers of the wire to find out what flow rate they recommend. Since I'm using Hobart wire with a Hobart machine, with a Hobart manual, I'm going to go ahead and set it up for the 20. If that's too much or too little, let me know in the comments. I can always make adjustments later. All right, so I got the machine on. Go ahead, open the valve. Now I'm just going to depress the trigger on the gun and set my flow rate. Right there. Okay, so now we're back in the machine. I turned the gas off at the tank. Now we need to install our wire. And I don't want to be wasting gas while I'm installing the wire, so I'll turn the tank back on once we get the wire in. Now that I got the spool in, before I go ahead and start feeding wire through, I need to adjust my feed spool because I have it set up for flux cord wire. And I need to set it up for solid wire, and I am running a 0.30. So I just need to look at the side of the wheel and adjust that to the 0.30. Then I just pull the trigger until the wire comes out, trying to keep the line somewhat straight. Alright, so I got the gas back on, machine's all set up, ready to go. Change the settings for the new solid wire versus the flux core, because the settings like the amperage and wire speed do change. I just set them to the chart that's in the machine. I think we're ready to go ahead and do a test here on this, and I'm a little bit nervous. Spent a lot of money getting this set up. I hope this is going to pay off. Well, there's my first weld with gas, and I don't think it's too horrible. I definitely need to figure out my technique and get that worked out a little bit, because I do think that based on my flux core weld, that one looks really nice and neat. This one here is a little big and probably a little bit too much buildup on it for my liking. But I think I'm going to cut a couple more pieces, run a couple practice beads with the gas, and see what I come up with. So I cut a few more pieces and did 2 more welds with the gas, and I think they turned out much better. Just for comparison, here is the flux core weld, which again is the best flux core weld I've ever had. Normally I end up with some porosity, some little holes and stuff in there. I've never had one looking this clean before. Then my very first gas weld, I tried a push method where with the flux core I did a pull, so I pulled the gun towards me, weaving back and forth. This one I pushed away from me, weaving back and forth, and I ended up with a pretty thick weld and had a little bit of porosity, a little bit of holes right there at the end, and I don't think it's the nicest weld. So then I did my second gas one, and that weld looks a lot more consistent and a lot nicer. I'm really happy with that. I don't think you can get much better than that. At least I can't get much better than that. I'm sure other people can, but for me that's pretty darn good. And then this one is my third one. I tried slowing down a little bit and got a little bit smaller there in the middle, but again, very consistent height, very consistent weld. I am very happy with that. So now let's talk about pros and cons for the 2 different styles. And we'll start with pros for the flux core. I think the biggest pro is it's cheaper to start out with. You buy one $120 spool and you're ready to weld. You can go. The gas, you got to buy the tank, you got to buy the gas, and you got to buy a spool. Granted, the spool is only $55–60, where the flux core spool is like $120. But you got to buy the tank, which, like I said earlier, was a big expense, and you got to buy the gas. Once you own the tank, I think that overall the gas will be a cheaper option. It's just going to take you a long time to recoup that tank cost. The other plus side to flux core is it's a lot more forgiving with dirty metal, a little bit of rust, a little bit of paint. It'll still weld because your protecting material is inside the wire itself. It's also good for outdoor environments where you have wind, because you don't have to worry about the wind blowing your gas away. Your protectant's right in the wire, so it's going to stay there even in windy situations. Downside to the flux core is I think it's a harder practice. I don't think it's as easy to pick up quickly and get a nice looking weld. I think it takes a little more practice, more like stick welding. Another downside is you get a lot more spatter. It spatters more, it creates more of a mess. You end up with little metal bumps over a larger area than you do with the gas. So with the gas, oh, that's the other downside to flux core, I almost forgot. your protecting material ends up bubbling to the surface and staying on the top, so you have to clean every single one of your welds, which I think you saw me do with the wire brush. Just came through, brushed it off. That's all good and fine, but when you have two angles meeting in an inside corner and you're welding inside that corner, it is really hard to clean out that inside corner. And that makes painting difficult because you don't want to have any of that dirt or leftover weld material there because the paint won't adhere as well. So to me, that's kind of a bigger downside. So now the downside to the gas welding is it's not very good for outdoor use. If you're in a windy environment, it's going to blow your gas away and you're going to end up with your little pinholes in the weld like I did at the end there. So that respect, it's not very good. The other big downside for me was just the upstart cost, which is why I didn't go with it to begin with. That tank, man, is expensive to buy. Like I said, it was $487, I think I said it was, just to buy the tank. So that's a big expense, plus the gas, and you still got to buy wire. The plus side is I think it's a much easier practice to do. Like my first 2 welds on it were way better than even my very best weld on the flux core. It's much easier to see the puddle and see the weld. You don't have all that extra protectant material over the top, making it harder to see. And you get less spatter. It's a nice clean weld. There's still some, little bumps around or whatever you want to call them, but not nearly as much as the flux core. And you don't have to clean off after your weld. You're done. You can just wipe it down, paint, and you're good to go. Here's another downside to the gas though. When you run out of gas, you're done. Whether you have wire or not, you got to go run and get gas. With flux core, I can have a spool on and I can buy a second spool and have it sitting here. When our first spool runs out, I can just throw another spool on, keep going. With the gas, I got to drop the tank, I got to run in, exchange it, come back with the new tank, hook it all back up again. Or I have to do double the expense, buy a second tank so I can swap them and then take the other one to get refilled while the other one's being used. But that's a big expense. So that's kind of my comparison. I still think for me the gas is going to be the way to go. I'm really happy with how those welds turned out with even just doing 3 small welds. Well, that's all I got for today. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. You learned something. I know I'm learning something. Again, I'm no expert, but this is what I'm seeing. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.